First, I want to make an invitation to you to two Martin Luther collections I'm involved in. You, I'm sure, have heard of this, of the Richard Kessler Reformation Collection at Crumley Seminary in Atlanta. I've been secretary of that for 37 years. We've been collecting for 37 years. It is now, by far, the best collection of Martin Luther original material in America. It's only second to a few libraries in Germany. Have 80% of his works. It's a wonderful collection. I want to issue an invitation to individuals, to couples, to groups, to come see it. If you want to see the 1522 September Testament, if you want to see a first edition Augsburg Confession, if you want to see a real 16th century indulgence, a regular indulgence, and a plenary indulgence. A plenary indulgence forgives all sins. It's in Pitt's library. I can help you with these corrections. I just talked to librarian Bo Adams. He says, yes, please come, and you're certainly welcome. The second thing I've been involved in, you'll see here, unusual. It is an exhibit, a museum of Martin Luther. It tells the history in here, but basically, James and I had a classmate, Paul Arnold, who for 53 years collected everything Lutheran. I don't have to tell you how much it is. And we have 4,000 items in the collection. It's large, it has quantity, and it has quality. Richard Kessler made this happen, and he brought it back to his home church, Jerusalem Lutheran Church. It's located across the street at the retreat center, and it's first class. I would like, if you would, to kind of help us get the word out. I think once people see it, they will appreciate it. 2 days ago, Paul said, I found something else. I've got some pins from Lutheran churches in Russia. You said, you know, Russia had sizable Lutheran congregations before 1917 and the revolution. I said, bring them on. We can add that to all the other. So we really have a lot of artifacts you could call from all over the world, Luther League and all over the world. We had someone come last week, I talked to them, they said, this is great. I'm going back to Charlotte, I'm going to bring a group. I called my friend in Ohio, you need to bring the group down. I had with me, two of us, I had a Baptist with me, she loved it. She said, I'm going back, I'm going to read the book on Luther. Well, for the agenda for the evening, I got a call from Bishop Bill Trexler. He has a major injury to his thigh. He cannot travel, and he said, would you take my place? I wanted to have a surprise announcement to our classmate of the Greever Award. So I have his remarks, and this is Trexler's remarks. Walton Harlow Greever was a man of boundless energy which he applied to the love of the gospel of Jesus Christ as well as the institution of the Lutheran Church. His leadership influenced Mrs. Lohman to donate 1,000 acres for what became today the Lohman Home for the Aged and Infirmed. He was the force behind bringing the seminary from Charleston to Columbia. He served as the second secretary for the United Lutheran Church in America. Dr. Greever was pastor of Ascension Lutheran Church across the street. He served in the South Carolina Synod as its president, Southern Seminary as professor of ethics and the science of religion, and all Lutherans in our country of the American Lutheran Survey. He was instrumental in establishing 2 South Carolina committees, evangelism and stewardship. Well, some years ago, the board of this archives, James Crumley Archives, established the Walton Harlow Greever Award. They did so to honor persons who have exemplary lives and have loved the Lord in their daily life. Dr. Greever defines stewardship as, quote, the practice of the Christian religion, end of quote. Tonight we honor 2 stewards, James and Celie Addy. whose lies closely aligned to Dr. Greever's definition. And this is your friend Bill talking. When I think of James Addy, I use words like steadfast, loyal, rock solid come to mind. James grew up in St. James, Graniteville, where his father was pastor. Later he served as president of the South Carolina Lutheran League. And Bill says, I've known you since 1966. We were in seminary. And one year, when we were in seminary, you worked at St. Andrews, Charleston, where Celie Addy was a member. And that union has not only blessed you, but blessed all of us. James's first call was a mission developer of Redeemer Greever. Later, he was elected secretary of the South Carolina Synod. Over the years, he served as a delegate to 5 ELCA conventions and voting member at 3 ELCA assemblies. Archivist Shannon Smith told me, if it were not for James Addy and Treaty Bucknight, I would never have learned about South Carolina Lutheran history. It was such a help when I first get started. James and Celie were the first couple married in Christ Chapel. I, Roy Wise, was a member of the wedding party. Celie, you exemplify love, acceptance of diversity, and a fierce advocate for justice and racial healing. She was an early supporter of the Charleston's African American Museum. You lead with a caring heart and used your organizational abilities to help in so many volunteer roles. For a season, you served the South Carolina Synod as Director of Communication. And that video here is an example of her creative talent. Celie and James are the parents of Karen and Lynn. Raise your hand. They're here today. For 40 years, the Trexlers and the Addys had a vacation together on mutual support and caring. And Celie wrote an article for the Lutheran magazine about those great times. In addition to your computer skills, you have a love affair with flowers. And your garden is the envy of the neighborhood. You're hostess with the mostest. And if you ever find yourself at the beach with James, you'll be amazed at his talent in creating sand sculptures. Both James and Celie are long-time supporter of this Crumley Archives. Like Dr. Greever, for whom this award is named, James and Celie embody love of the gospel of Jesus Christ, as well as the institution of the Lutheran Church. Bill says, I love you, James and Celie, and I love you, James and Celie. And I know all of us you too. Therefore, it gives me so much pleasure, on behalf of the Archives Board, to announce you as recipients of this year's Walton H. Greever Award.
So much. And I look out and so many of you are just equally, you should be up here. I wrote some notes so I don't go down a rabbit hole, but I wanted to tell you something. So when I began working at the Synod office in 1990, our one electronic communication to the outside world was a phone line with a dial-up modem. And if somebody needed it, they went down the hall and said, please stay off that line for a few minutes. So, you know, time goes on, you get computers, you actually get networked together in the building, and you can do more. But there was a time when we needed to get important news, timely news out to our roster of leaders. And all we had at that point was a telephone tree. Do you remember that? So what happened was you had your list of people that you were supposed to call, and if we needed to use it, we had to stop everything we were doing, call the people on our list, and hope to goodness they got the message and called other people. Well, at one point I found out from a pastor that it had been more than 3 years since he had received a telephone tree message. And that's why we started the Synod e-news. So we did that, and you know, time goes on, you get more and more involved in the electronic world. Well, we got to a point where, for me, and I wrote this down, Neil, you'll appreciate this. At times, it could be really exhausting because you're working with the print world and you're working with the electronic world. So, trying to keep the plate spinning, I had the South Carolina Lutheran, the network, the website, the e-news, social media, quarterly supplements to the Lutheran magazine, Synod assembly preparation, and more. What happened was, sometimes those things all converged and the deadlines hit all at the same time. So, one of those times I found myself in my office with the door closed, grumbling. I was trying to get way too many words edited down into that center section of the South Carolina Lutheran that told the stories from congregations. It was a bear, and I was getting more and more aggravated as I went along, and I found myself thinking, nobody is ever going to read this. So it was kind of an interesting timing because right then, God sent me a messenger. There was a knock on the door, and I thought, I don't need another interruption, but there was a knock on the door. Dory Campbell came in, and she said, she'd been working with Appalachian Ministries. She came in and she said, Celie, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I've been in a meeting here, and before I leave, I just had to come tell you how much the churches I work with appreciate this section. And she opened up. She said that her congregations really, really appreciated reading what other congregations were doing in their ministries. And she said that it gave them wonderful ideas for what they might be able to do in their places. So the reason I'm telling you this is, we never know how important our stories are going to be. We really don't. And the Crumley Archives gathers our stories, protects our stories, and shares our stories. And I'm very, very grateful. And that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
A little show and tell. That's a hard act to follow.
I thought this was doggy bag.
I start by giving honor to note takers, document keepers, and what we might call in the church scribes. I begin with my father, who, because of cancer, lived with us the last 8 months of his year. I asked if there was anything he wanted to do while he still could. I was thinking about something like a trip to Salem, Virginia, where he was on the board of trustees there for 26 years. His response was, I'd like to go at home and sort my papers. Well, I didn't make that happen. So I was left to do something with his papers. Fortunately, I did not throw them out. Among the things I discovered was the hospital bill when I was born. With a 50% minister's discount. A 3-day stay in the hospital for my mother and me. The final bill was $8.75. I'm older than you thought I was. Among other things I discovered were carbon copies of letters he wrote to congregations declining their interest in calling him to be their pastor. And that was something I never knew anything about. You may have noticed on the video that I served as the first secretary of the South Carolina Synod within the ELCA. Most people only remember Ozzie Hurlong. I remember realizing and joking about the power of a secretary. I provided minutes from handwritten notes and from memory, and when the minutes were approved at the next Synod Council meeting, there were very few corrections. That was not because I was 99% correct, but it was because people don't remember the actual details. And thus, that shows me how much secretaries and how they state things goes a long way in shaping history. In 1998, I bought a copy of Walter Egger's South Carolina History. I finally read it last month. The history portion is almost 600 pages. The footnotes that follow that are 100 pages and 20 or more footnotes on each page. That's over 2,000 footnotes that Walter Egger used in order to write that history, the finished product. Professor Egger relied on note takers, document keepers, and scribes. When the Synod produced a supplemental history to cover the latter years within the LCA, I was asked to write a section on Camp Conard and the Coastal Retreat. I had some very personal knowledge of those years, but I added footnotes from the reports printed in the minutes of the Synod conventions. In the latest history of the Synod, Dr. Hugh George Anderson had responsibility for the section that included retreat centers. I highly respect Dr. Anderson. He was my church history professor. However, I recall a phone conversation with him during which I, carefully as I could, tried to shape the history more positively than it seemed to be taking shape. Dr. Anderson footnoted that telephone conversation. I have other stories about the importance of note takers, document keepers, or scribes, but I'll end with a story of someone who was for 2 terms an official scribe of the United Lutheran Church in America. That person is Dr. F. Ephraim Reiners. I have this memento here. That none of you would associate with Dr. Reiners. LTSS fielded a team that participated in a basketball league run by the YMCA. Celie likes to tell this part of the story because she was sitting near Dr. Reiners in the bleachers and heard him say,
"Way to go, Jim."
He was one of the few people I didn't try to correct and have him call me James. But the rest of this story is that after the game, or perhaps a different game, one of the opposing players collapsed in the dressing room with a massive heart attack. Dr. Reinhardt heard of this and came to help in the situation in any way he could. The young man died that night, leaving a wife and very young child. Several of us players joined Dr. Reinhardt in going to the funeral. We, at least I, awkwardly hung back, but Dr. Reinhardt joined the family, and I'm sure led them in prayer. What an example of ministry that was for me. I've not looked at this jersey and not thought of that incident. Thank you for honoring us with the Greever Award. I accept it on behalf of note takers, document keepers, and scribes, those who inform us of what was. Thank you.